Well, good morning or good afternoon. It was a very good introduction, and this is actually the second time I've been to the European Leadership Forum. I went back in 2004 when it was in Hungary. This is also the second time I've been to Poland. The first time was the Summer of Solidarity in 1981 when I was a student. But I'm here, and I want this to be more informal. Most of the words on the slides are in the app, but the slides aren't. And I've been working on this and thinking about it over the last year. It develops out of a series of classes that I've been doing at my church, but also at the university. This past year, I did a history of Western civilization in the relation of techne and Sophia, technology and wisdom. And I've been thinking about how that works in relation of the ancients and the moderns. And so this will be an informal talk, but I'm going to challenge you on a few things because we are living in a different age, and we're in the middle of it. And so I thought it would be interesting to do some comparative. There will be some texts on here, but I'm trying to sort of move away from pure text. And so please feel free. I will ask you some questions sometimes, and you will have to answer. But I wanted to get the sense, and I hope as I come in with a group in media and communications that you haven't all heard this before. And so it's a little bit of trepidation that's there. But I want us to think about the nature and impact of technology. The premise that I have is that our digital age is an analogous to the print age. Okay, the invention of the press is an enormously transformative period in the history of the West and the history of the world. I would say there's maybe three that we could look at over the last 2,500 years. The first is the invention of the alphabet. The second, the invention of the printing press. The third, of the digital age. Okay, I just wanted to think about that. And so as you could read this on your own, but here, what will be the impact of digital technology on biblical Christianity? And how should we shape our message in this new digital age? And I think about it, this is a group of Protestant Christians. Protestant Christians are based on print and print technology. Without print technology, there would be no Reformation. Right? You had small groups, people like John Wycliffe, right, translating the Bible into the local language, but they were very quickly suppressed. You know, Jan Hus from this region was very quickly suppressed. The inability to get those ideas public. But that understanding of the press shapes not only religion, but the rest of culture too. The development of the nation state is dependent on the printed text. Individualism is dependent on the printed text. So I want us to think about that. Now, the Bible is a technology as well, and some of it you don't think about this, and we'll talk about technology here, and sometimes it's so obvious that you don't even think about it. It hit me 2 years ago, the answer to this question. Why are there 10 commandments? Why are there 10 commandments? I never realized this. The really easy answer. Why are there 10 commandments? Because we have 10 fingers. That's the reason, right? That's the reason, and it's a technology, right? To understand and help us to think through, right? Different kind of digital. So the Bible is technology. What is the Bible? In a very basic sense, translated, what is it?
Collection of books?
It's a library. Yes, it's a collection of books. That's what it physically is. And I want us to think about that as we sort of have it, the shift from a printed text to maybe something on screen. I'm going to ask you to think about it. How has your reading of the Bible changed in the last 12 years? Why 12 years? Because that's when the smartphone is invented. All right, very good. How has it changed?
More available?
More available, okay. You don't have to bring a big book, right? You can pick up this way.
More translations.
More translations, right? Right, more translations.
Shorter passages to read, very small snippets.
Very short, small snippets, right? How else?
Less use of memory.
Less use of memory, right? Yeah, why do you need to memorize something if it's all on your phone, right?
By word, it's possible.
You could do even individual words, right? And do word searches. You could switch over to Greek. You could switch back to, right? Okay.
If you got your glasses, it's useful because you can.
Okay, sometimes it's too small, but you can make it big. Okay, all right. You could do it audio, right? You can have it listened. Yeah? Yeah. Yeah, it's easy to share. Okay.
But no longer writing notes in the margin.
No writing notes in the margins. Yeah, they're not set up at a page that way. Okay, yeah.
It would be harder to see the context of the actual verse or chapter.
It's harder to see the context of the actual verse or chapter, okay? And it helps, and okay, every morning, 2 Bible verses come up on my email from the Moravians. Does anybody know the Moravians, right? To me, it's exciting because they have been giving 2 Bible verses a day every single day since the year 1734. They've been just amazing kind of thing. Yeah, but now it's on the text. It's very interesting, and so that's part of my morning devotional. But that's automatic, that comes in, and I seldom go back to the text. What? Yeah, from Moravia. It's actually very close to here, if I know. Yeah. So I want us to think about that. Think about also what that emphasizes, right? This emphasizes not long stories, but individual verses, right? And maybe small paragraphs at the most, maybe 100 words at the most. Does it follow, say, a linear rational argument? Maybe not. And so I want us to think about that as we look. Now, I went back and let's sort of define technology very quickly. And of course, I thought Wikipedia would be useful because in an age of right, that's something also new. It's only about, not even 20 years old. Wikipedia is about 15 years old. But technology, the science of craft from the Greek techne, and logia. The Oxford English Dictionary has it Latin and Greek, one of the first uses in the early 17th century. Here's one. The branch of knowledge dealing with the mechanical arts and the applied sciences and the study of this. That's what, in some ways, we're going to look at. Now, I hesitate to bring someone in, but I've been studying one of the more important media scholars and have been kind of amazed at how prescient he was. Because if you're looking at a digital age, when does this begin? The digital age, technologically. A digital, everything is in zeros and ones. And it took me quite a while to realize what the 1 and 0 is when the start, right? I didn't quite get that, but it did, okay.
Maybe 1984.
Maybe 1984, okay. All right. Yeah, earlier. Okay. What is one of the first digital communication devices? And the actual on and off switch?
Telegraph.
It's a telegraph, yeah, it's a telegraph. Going back, and actually, speaking of the US Capitol, there is a plaque in the US Capitol because the first telegraph message was sent by Samuel F.B. Morse from Washington, D.C. in the Capitol to the city of Baltimore in 1844. So it's an interesting sort of connection. But I want us to think about that as well because the telephone is not a digital device. It's an analog device. Telegraph is, but there is a conflict in the two sort of technologies in the 1940s between whether one should communicate analog or digital. And some of my doctoral work or some of the recent work that I've been doing is looking at some of that transition, especially with the figure of Norbert Wiener. Anybody heard of Norbert Wiener? Probably not. You've heard of the term cybernetics. He invents that. He invents that term. Also early artificial intelligence, machine learning. And what he's doing it is in the context of the Second World War. He's a mathematician, and he is trying to figure out how to have automatic aiming devices for anti-aircraft guns. That's sort of the origin of artificial intelligence and a digital environment in the 1940s. But there's another philosopher and media philosopher that I've been looking at in the past few years. And I discovered that he's a Christian. And that's Marshall McLuhan. Everybody's heard of Marshall McLuhan. Or at least in this group, most of them have. The idea of we shape our tools and then they shape ourselves. We've heard of the medium as the message, and we'll look at that. But as I was sitting in the back listening to the presentation just before on the Big Bang Theory, it just hit me, right? And so I typed this back in. Anyone who tries to make a distinction between education and entertainment doesn't know the first thing about either one. And yes, that connection, that's what, right? Anyway, so I've been thinking about McLuhan and thinking about the Bible as part of technology and some of the significance that are there. Whoops, I lost the slide. Okay, technology shapes how we look at who and where we are. We've seen this photograph, or rather a mosaic of 3,000 photographs from the Earth, from space in the summer. So the Earth doesn't look like this. But it's exciting to actually see because I grew up with maps on the wall, and green was always the lowland. Here, green is trees. So it makes a little more sense to see where we are. Now, let's look at from McLuhan, right? And I want to hit the lights real quick. There we go. So we've got that, right? What's this an image of? Okay, this is actually lights. This is the same photograph, but at night. Okay, now we can pop the things back on, the lights back on. Well, what is it a picture of? Maybe that last one, keep off. Oh, perfect, yeah. So then people won't fall asleep, but we can still see the image. What is this of? What is the image of? And let's repeat it. I know a few shouted out specific things. Electric light, world from space, right? What else is it? It could be a population map, a civilization map, a modernization, right? Industry in certain areas, yeah. It's not fully tracking population. It is tracking electricity and light and the understanding of what light means. Because let's go back to Bible times. What do you do at night? It's like going from the city to a small town. They, as we say in the United States, they roll up the sidewalks at night because nothing goes on there. But a city, right? A city gives you night. You can actually do something there. Or like in here, this is a medium that has no content. There's no content to electricity, is there? You can do anything you wanted, but that is what McLuhan is getting at with the understanding of the medium is the message, right? It's the medium. This is the medium. It extends our senses. It gives us night, completely transforms everything, but has absolutely no content. It was interesting listening to the presentation because how McLuhan would say it, the content is less important than the fact that everybody is watching television. And last Sunday, this may be because I'm getting old, but it's also maybe because I'm attuned to questions in media. They've got a screen in our church, and sometimes the pastor will play a 2-minute or a 4-minute video clip. And I'm just like cringing because all we're doing, no matter what's on the screen, all we're doing is watching television. And that's a different medium, and it may not be the one that is best suited for the expression of the word, okay? But let's keep that in the back of our minds. So what is this an image of? It's an image also of power, not just electrical power, but power in a real sort of fundamental sense, Macht, right? So here, this is McLuhan, if you can read this, if I can. The student of media will but meditate on the power of this medium of electric light to transform every structure of time and space and work and society that it penetrates or contacts. He will have the key to the form of power that is in this media to reshape any lives which they touch. Okay? None of us grew up before electricity. We live in it, right? It's a fish in water. We don't even think about it. Right? But I want us to see that power to transform every structure of time and space and work and society, because that's what technology does. Now here, can you find where North Korea is? Right? There's no power there. In very many, even though they have nuclear power, right? They're a nuclear power, but in that sense they're not. Actually, there's one fellow here, this is an exciting conference, who's actually a North Korean refugee. Christian now, and he's in one of the other, see, I had a great chance to talk to him last night. Now, in a footnote, and this is, I'm going to go a little quicker, but here, this is from one of the students of McLuhan, Neil Postman. Everybody knows Neil Postman, I assume, here, or because you're all media folk. There's a short little piece that he writes, and I've put it as a footnote, but this is from 1998, a little over 20 years ago. 5 sort of theses on technology. All technological change is a trade-off. There's always a price to pay for technology. It would be awesome that we could all learn Latin again and have everybody speak Latin, right? Because that's what Christendom was, and so all you would need to do is learn a second language to be educated, to be able to teach everybody and talk to everybody in the world. Now, in this place, yeah, because of English is English, now English is in some ways becoming that language. But we lose something in that. And what will take place when the Reformation comes is the disappearance of Latin, and instead the Bible in every individual language, meaning that Christians can no longer talk one to another. Bible in German versus a Bible in Romanian, that means those Christians have no common language anymore. So always a trade-off. Advantages and disadvantages of tech are not evenly distributed. There's some winners and some losers. The medium is the message. Technology embodies ideas and epistemology. Tools shape ourselves. Before writing, you had an oral culture. So Proverbs. King Solomon knew 3,000 Proverbs. That's a pre-literate culture. How many of you know 500 Proverbs? You don't need to know that anymore once you get writing, do you? But if you want aphorisms or proverbs, that's what you stick in the memory. We've lost the ability to do, like recite Homer, for example, have a Greek culture and how that was shaped. Before writing, proverbs and poetry. Writing, though, provides logical order. You cannot do philosophy with smoke signals, right? You can't. You simply can't. You can't really do it either in an oral culture either. Telegraph gives you speed, but not introspection, right? TV gives you the immediacy, but have you ever seen a sermon on television? Oh, gosh, that's boring, right? It's a different kind of medium. Computers give you information, but doesn't have that chance of reflection or knowledge that's there. To a person with a computer, everything is data. You know those kind of people, right? Everything is data to those folk. All of it's zeros and ones, zeros and ones. If you think about why certain parts of political culture is becoming polarized, right? We've seen that. Well, obviously, if your only choice is on or off, where's the possibility of nuance? Yeah, it's a little simplistic, but if you only have on and off, you either go one way or the other. So there's nothing in the middle. Yeah, that possibility of compromise with an on or off. How do you go half on? Doesn't make sense. So it shapes it, right? Technological change is not additive. It's ecological. A new medium does not add something, it changes everything. Like light, electricity changes everything, okay? Changes completely everything. For example, television and politics, right? We understand it. It's not politics and political debate plus television. Television completely changes the nature of what politics is. And then the media becomes mythic. It's part of the natural order. Postman in this article is amazed when he has to teach his students that there was a time before the alphabet, right? Or that something as simple as 10 fingers is the reason for the 10 Commandments. I mean, I was in my 50s before I realized that. Why don't they teach that in Sunday school? But that's a tool for memorization. You don't need to do that when you've got the plaque on the wall, right? Okay, so those things on Postman. So we'll go back to oral to written. Pictographic writing is invented numerous times in all different ways. The alphabet is invented once for all. And the different cultures of a Western model, for example, right, and the Western alphabet versus Chinese pictographs, quite a bit different. And we think about it, it takes a while for China to, well, develop a modern system. How do you have approximately 3,000 characters. It's the bases for a literate Chinese person. You have 22 characters here. You can learn an alphabet, any alphabet, in about an hour, maybe 2 hours. To learn 3,000 Chinese characters will take you years, right? That will shape that class structure. The old cuneiforms or the hieroglyphics also enables a radical different social class of a learned class versus everybody else. This is a democratic medium, the alphabet. Pictographs are not. Think about it, how if you have 3,000 characters, how do you file something, right? What comes first, what comes next? How do you set up a keyboard on something like that? Yeah, but it may be a better mirror of certain kinds of reality. It may be able to express different kinds of ideas, okay? Now, one of the most important sort of developments in the West is the Greeks and the development of Greek rationality. And you know from Homer to Socrates to Plato to Aristotle. Homer is an oral poet, right? We have memorized culture and you have poets. You can imagine, this is a great circle, right? We'd be here, there's no lights, the only illumination would be the fire, and you'd have traveling bards who have memorized these tens of thousands of lines. And you repeat it, and you memorize and get sections of that. And that's the only night. That's how culture is developed and passes on, an oral culture. Socrates never writes anything down. Plato writes things down in a dialogue form. And Aristotle, he's a lecturer. So, you know, he's the academic. So one is actually, it's fun to read Plato and it's boring to read Aristotle. But notice this transition that will take place worldwide, what historians call the axial age. Confucius is writing at about the same time. A little bit before that, Amos is writing, the prophet, right? And what wants to see is a dramatic transformation between an oral culture to one that is based on the alphabet. And there's very few times this happens, but Socrates is there, and Plato's there to record it, of someone self-consciously understanding the transition. And in the dialogue Phaedrus, there's a story right towards the end where Phaedrus is telling the tale of the invention of writing in Egypt. And he says, you know, isn't that a great invention? And Socrates says, no, it's not really. I don't think writing is a good idea. And listen to what he says. It will create forgetfulness in the learner's soul because they will not use their memories. They will trust the external written characters and not remember of themselves. The specific which you have discovered is an aid not to memory, but to reminiscence. And it will give your disciples not truth, but only the semblance of truth. They will be hearers of many things and will have learned nothing. They will appear to be omniscient and will generally know nothing. They will be tiresome company, having the show of wisdom without the reality. Ooh, okay. Socrates is seeing they're outsourcing their data, right? They're outsourcing their memory. No longer will you memorize. Like, you'll also talk about something else, too. It's dead on the page. And what you want to be able to do is interact with that person who's there. If you don't understand, you ask him or her what you mean. You can't do that on a page. So the loss of memory in that dead text, okay, that's there. Very interesting to sort of see what that means. We'll come back to that. Now here's something as you look at in the Bible, the oral tradition, the Old Testament. We had a very interesting discussion a couple days ago on 2 Kings 22, when King Josiah finds the book of the law. What? That's crazy when you think about it. Hundreds of years the book of the law was lost. In the 18th year of his reign, King Josiah sent the secretary, Shaphan, son of to the temple of the Lord, and he found the book of the law. I thought these were the big tablets, right? And then sort of written down that everybody was memorizing. Well, they were, but they didn't know the rest of the law. What's interesting, the passage goes on that Josiah does the first time the Passover is actually done the way it's supposed to be. Like 400 years after the Passover is set out in the Pentateuch. So what you've got is a written culture and an oral culture, and the oral culture is what people are doing, and the scribes are the ones to keep it, but they got forgetting, and they sort of put it in the back corner, and they completely forget about it, and all of a sudden you have to find the book of the law. This little piece here is like 3 weeks ago, they found the guy's signet ring, this guy. And so showing and notice the signet ring that you will have your signature, right, on official documents using that text. But they actually found one they were digging up a parking lot in Jerusalem. One of the only attestations of such a minor figure, but it's there. So anyway, that was kind of cool. I want you to do that. Let's take a look at the New Testament, the oral tradition in the New Testament. Socrates never writes anything down. Jesus only wrote something once in the sand. That's it, right? Purely oral teacher, not a written one, right? And so that same shift from Socrates to Plato is from Jesus to maybe Paul or maybe Luke or Mark. Okay. And I was thinking on the road to Emmaus. Let's think about this. Jesus was preacher, a teacher, and this is in the end on the road to Emmaus. And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them everything that was said in the scriptures concerning himself. Okay, I was teaching on this text in an adult education class, and this is what print enables us to do, or what rather text enables us to do. Not print, but text enables us to do. Because we had this one very godly man who said, wow, wouldn't I have liked to have been there to hear, right, how our hearts burned within us on the road as he explained this to us. And I thought, let's see. Well, what would you do if you're the author, Luke? What would you do? Because that's what Luke is saying and putting that right at the end of the gospel according to Luke. Right? What would you do as a listener to that text? What would you want? What?
Go back and look up.
Well, yeah, but you can't really look it up because they are expensive scrolls, right? So you don't know this. So you could look it up, but you're a poor fisherman, right? So what would you expect as you're listening to this text? Okay, you want to memorize it. And so how are you going to do it? Wow, I wish I could have been there, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, explaining everything in the scriptures concerning himself. You could with what? Not with one of these, right? Let's think. If you're listening to this around the campfire, or rather in the lit synagogue, right, with some windows, you're listening to this, what do you want from that person who gives that text, that one text written down? What? Okay, explain it to you. And it sort of hit me there. Well, duh, maybe Luke is setting up the sequel, right? He's setting up the sequel very clearly. And so what do you expect as the listener in that next book? And so I challenge you, test me on this, but take a look at from Acts 2 to Acts 10. There's like 5 different speeches or sermons in there. And what will those content be? Beginning with Moses and all the prophets. Every single one, right, is going text by text by text. Yeah, and it sort of hit me, and it was like, okay, that's fascinating how an oral culture is experiencing the written text, right? And it's shaping how you can actually act, right? And how you now are writing that in memory, okay, with those texts. So go back, what are some of the effects of the technological shift from the oral to the written? What were some of those effects? Sorry for the quiz. But I want us to think about that, right? We know Paul, as some of Paul's letters, right? You can feel it. You're in the room with the scribe. Silas is writing things down, and Paul is dictating almost, going back and forth. And you see it, and all of a sudden his mind changes, and he shifts to another topic, right? Like Galatians is like that. Now, I'll go real quickly, skip through this, because it shifts to the age of the scribe, right? The process of textual transmission, and we understand how sometimes errors and marginality will flip in. But the scribe is the one who's in some ways the authority. The material, the medium, papyrus and parchment are very expensive. The equivalent of a year's wages to have a small book like the Gospel of Luke. So you understand that only a few people will have this. But also think about the culture. You remember the story of Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch? You remember that? What's the story? How does Philip know the eunuch is reading Isaiah? What? He hears it. Because there's no tradition of silent reading at that point. No one reads silently. It's all oral. Libraries, and the Library of Alexandria is a very loud place because people are reading aloud. Yeah, and then also, do you understand what you are reading? How can I, he said, unless someone explains it to me? The role of the priest or the interpreter of the text. Okay? Silent reading, or rather oral reading, using your ears, right, the eye to the ear, and then the interpreter needs to explain.
Or Aquinas or somebody that they thought everybody thought he was mad because he was reading and his lips were moving.
That's one of the stories, yes. It's actually one of the most famous stories in the history of the West about this technology is, and I've got another slide on it, but it's a good time now, because that's a fascinating story. St. Augustine is a rhetorician. He's like the equivalent of one of the best university law professors. He's training people for the rhetoric of legal cases. And he goes up to see the Bishop of Milan, Ambrose, and he looks at him reading, and Ambrose's lips aren't moving. And Augustine has never seen that before. Somebody reading, first time in the history of the West, about the year 400 AD, someone reads silently. Wow. That's very interesting, okay? Anyway, there is a transition as well. The Old Testament is all written on scrolls. Remember Paul talks about bring the scrolls and the parchments, or bring the scrolls and especially the parchments. The first books that are written as a codex form are going to be the New Testament. And the New Testament is a codex rather than a scroll. Notice how difficult it would be to, if you're having, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, you got to roll this 40-foot long thing and trying to figure out what he's saying back here and then roll back up there. Whereas here, all you got to do is flip a few pages. It also makes this half the price, because in the scroll, you only write on one side. The codex, you write on two. Here you see that image, right? A youthful St. Paul shown on the right, brandishing a sword and holding an open scroll. The older St. Peter, partially hidden, turns towards and grasps the scroll. It's something that often you need two people to read, too. Somebody to hold the other edge, right? But here you see in the West the codex and that use of the text. And that's going to shape how you think, because now you're able to quote much more accurately, right? You don't have to have it in your memory like you do in the scroll, that transitional part. Okay, think of the transmission of text and that process of transmission. One reading, you oftentimes reading aloud and everyone sort of recording it, or how you do with lecture in a university. One book that will be read and copied because of the cost of these things. And that means that this fellow is not doing original thinking. He's merely transmitting what has been given to him, right? So dissemination of knowledge rather than individual creativity and individual thought. That's one possibility. Now, what do you do? Whoops, where do we go? Okay. What do you do with the layman, with the laity? What you do is you build cathedrals, right? And you, inside those cathedrals, you make them full of pictures to show the stories. And the Stations of the Cross, for example, if you have been in a Catholic church or you have a Catholic tradition, very clearly the visual images to tell the story. There's no pictures in the Bible, right? It was very difficult to copy those kinds of things. There may be restrictions on graven images, maybe. But also, how do you tell the stories? Well, you use this kind of image that's there, or these images that are carved in stone. Everybody knows what the last words are, some of the words of the Last Supper were? Everybody who wants to be in the picture, get on this side of the table. Sorry, that's an old joke, but just to sort of lighten it up. You have the images, for example, of the Last Judgment. Michelangelo's fabulous image. And you see the cross here, the altar. What's the problem with painting? I mean, you can really see what's going on, right? But what's the problem with painting and art?
Can't take it with you.
Can't take it with you. Only those who can be allowed in the Sistine Chapel can see these images, right? It's not a very democratic approach, democratic medium. Let's shift over now, the print revolution. Quickly, Gutenberg and the Bible, we'll talk about Martin Luther. Martin Luther is going to be the best-selling author of his day. It's something like a third of all books in Germany in the early 16th century are written by Luther. It's incredible. Print and authority, the German Bible, pulpit and preacher, printing in the Protestant Reformation. Okay? And we understand the story of Gutenberg and his Bible. 1450 or so, a very intensely capitalized process. But the ability to break down ideas into individual replicable type and set those and reset those. It's just enormously transformative. And here you see some of the typesetters in the back, the sort of inking these and the mechanical process of replication. And here's a sort of a mock-up and a make-up of that. The earliest Bible, first thing he's going to do is a very large Bible. Folio size, right? A very large one, 42 by 30 centimeters. Big. What do you do with a book that big? You chain it to the pulpit because it's so pricey. And it's also designed for oral reading. Reading in a group to a congregation, right? That's what it's designed for. Interpreted by the priest. Here's the extent and the spread of the presses within 50 years. So the massive technology, but what's missing? I think we're here, right, on the Vistula. No press anywhere near. What is going to happen to press? Very highly capitalized, but also centralized. In Britain, you have it under the control of the University of Oxford, the University of Cambridge, and of the Crown. All right? There's some here because you've got these small Italian states, but Rome only controls the press here. There's a large number of presses here and a few scattered, and we want to sort of see what that is. And I'll skip over the kind of fragmentation of where Europe is. I think we're right about here, right, is where we are. And virtually no presses east at all, right? And it takes quite a long time to get a press. It takes a long time to get a press in the Ottoman Empire also, and that difference in how these are. One of the things, and this is, forgive me, but as part of my job, there was a student of ours, an older student, who spent a number of years collecting rare books. And he just donated a number to the university. And so this is his oldest, one of the earliest copies of Augustine's Confession. So I had a chance to hold this, 1475, 20 years after Gutenberg. And what was interesting, it's not a folio. It's now they're inventing books that are about this size that you can hold in your hand. And it's just marvelous to sort of see the typeface that is modeled after the scribal hand. Interesting on how this looks, and I know this is also another one, and this is that image, one of the most famous images of reading. Remember Augustine in the garden? He hears the sing-song rhyme, tolle lege, take and read, and he picks up the text, and he's converted because he reads that text aloud, of course, to his friend Alypius. But that is an interesting part of how we understand how important Augustine is in Protestant theology, okay? And now she's saying the time. We have a half hour. And so we'll, right? Good. So a couple other things too. It's ways to transmit scholarship. And so very early on, and this is actually from his collection, you have Greek texts and the rediscovery of Greek text along with the Latin so that you can learn Greek on your own. And you start to have small books that you can carry with you and you can put in your pocket. And you can cheaply own them, right? An individual type of reading rather than a group reading. One of the most important figures is going to be Erasmus, a Greek scholar who will take the New Testament and develop it and publish editions in Greek, Greek on one side, the Latin on the other, in order for us to check the translation, to go back to the original. I perceive that teaching, which is our salvation, was to be had in a much purer and more lively form if sought at the fountainhead and drawn from the actual sources. So I have revised the whole New Testament. And Luther uses the second edition. Now what also that does, this is also an early copy from the collection. Here's the early printer, the guy by the name of Aldous. The Adobe PageMaker, they named it after Aldous. But here is the censor, right? If you have centralized power and everybody knows who publishes it, the state police can come in and say, why are you publishing this? And this is the censor crossing out the name of Erasmus. And then later writing it back in when the ban is lifted. There was a great exhibit on censorship and centralized power that was held at the university. What is this? This is the early method that you would just censor the lines through. You could still read it underneath, but you knew that this was in some ways forbidden words. Then it goes to completely blacked out, and I love this one, right? Accept changes, boom. Right? That's a different, and often a self-censorship that's there. Here's many texts you'll see that things are crossed out, scribbled out, even cut out, because there are ideas that are in many ways dangerous to the authorities. Now, Protestantism, and I'll sort of go a little quickly. This is a copy of the first handbill printed of the 95 Theses. Luther will write it out by hand, post it where the normal place of disputation was. Some of his students will get it out, rush it over the printer, do it first in Latin, so it spreads the entire learned world, and then they'll do it in German so that everybody gets to know. This is the first text that goes viral. Literally, it's just all over the place, and this is going to be transformative. What you'll also get is the same kind of images, but now as cartoons, so that everybody can understand them. You don't have to go to the cathedral. You can actually have this. And so here is a 1525 woodcut of the forgiveness of Christ right here, right, outweighing the papacy and the indulgences there. And what do you do when you get texts? The Pope is going to issue a bull, sort of forbidding the expression of this and condemning Luther in his writings. But some people will respond. And so this is actually what Luther put in. That you see the Pope here demanding that his foot be kissed, the bull that has fire and brimstone coming out, and the responses of the peasants, which, yes, and it says, the Pope speaks, our sentences are to be feared, even if unjust, and the response, be damned, behold the furious race, our bare buttocks. Here, Pope, is thy belvedere, which is a beautiful view. You sort of see what the peasant, and so this is not a subtle medium, but it gives us a sense of, right, the popularization of images, the popularization of ideas. And one of Luther's enormous breakthroughs is he discovers that the Bible is a library. It's not a bunch of individual texts that you get every Sunday morning, right? Unconnected one with another, but rather they're long text treatises that have arguments worked out, so that when he reads the book of Galatians, he can follow Paul's argument. And that's the key for the theology of the Reformation. If you notice what the lectionary is, or what the texts every Sunday are, it's not an argument. It's text like a hypertext. And here the one, as you understand it, is a library. And so here he will stand, and this is the Dia de Worms. Unless I'm convinced by the testimony of Scripture, I am bound by Scripture. Here I stand on Scripture. Scripture is the authority. And that becomes one of the things that he first does, is to translate that text into the language of the people. What also does that do, though, very quickly? This is a graph from the 17th century during the English Civil War, because everyone is their own interpreter. If you have your own Bible, you have your own interpreter. And so you have this explosion of heresies, basically, because the Adamite I like. Did Adam and Eve wear clothes? We're supposed to follow these people, right? Yeah, how many wives did David have? So why can't I have a dozen? Or like Solomon, if I can afford it, 600 wives and 600 concubines? Various types of heresies as everyone interprets the Bible on their own. So you get, in the English version, the King James Bible as the official text that gets rid of all the marginal notes because it supports state power. Interesting sort of ways. Now let's jump ahead hundreds of years. Quickly, the Industrial Revolution, electricity and steam power, the railway and the telegraph. What do many of these things have in common? They're all centralizing technologies. As one commentator said, freedom of the press belongs to those who own one. And we want to look at technologies which either encourage authoritarian power and centralization, the censor, or democracy and decentralization. That's something we want to think about. Here you've got the image of modernization, right, of the railroad and the telegraph that will create a world, a modern world. And there's a very interesting piece that Victor Hugo writes in 1831. He'll actually write a book called Notre Dame. This leads to the restoration of that cathedral. We understand what happened to it. And actually, I was teaching on this in class a week before. But Hugo will write the story of the archdeacon who's sitting in his study with a window looking over Notre Dame Cathedral. And he holds a copy of a printed book. And he says to the person who's coming into the room, "This will destroy that." The printed book, notice how small, you can put it in your hand, will destroy the cathedral. The book, the text, is so transformative, so revolutionary, that those words on the paintings will be replaced by the book. An interesting sort of understanding, the same kind of thing that Socrates was saying, right? A shift from the visual culture to a written culture. Now, real quickly, shift to the digital. Binary, and binary code is a new alphabet. I know some folk have to go, and we're at 5 to 12. We have 20 minutes. Slip out, thank you. We're looking to look at, well, if we know all the world had one language, how many languages do we have now? One, right? All your languages can be translated into binary code and then translated into a different language, right? If you remember your Genesis 11, right? The Tower of Babel. All the world had one language. What's the story of the Tower of Babel? Who would keep a story like that? Think about it. You have to memorize that story, those 11 little verses. Who would keep that? Remember the building of the tower, right? Who builds the tower? Slaves. What is the God of the Bible? The liberator of slaves. They stopped building the tower, right? And so you can imagine a single language. What is the language? The language of those scribes of the authoritarian who are demanding that they build the tower, the slaves. And who keeps an oral story like that? The slaves. But fascinating. Now we have one language. What do you say? And you look at media, you can program or be programmed, right? Yeah, we want to see that. It's an authoritarian type of image. Okay. I already asked that. How has your Bible changed? You're reading the Bible in the last 12 years. And we'll look at some of the effects of digital culture, but we've got to have a little sum of how education it changes. This is from about 1899, where you have the professor putting the books in and everybody sort of listening in, the sort of centralized authority. It globalizes too. This is an image of the cables, the telegraph cables of about 100 years ago that Germany had, and Britain was significantly ahead of where Germany was, across the globe that were there. It's very similar. You ask what Paul would do with the internet, right? And you could see where those cables were. What did Postman say? There's winners and losers, right? Elch technology. So we know where internet traffic is. Take a look at where that was before, right? Now after. And you see where Facebook is too. And so this is actually from about 9 years ago. What's missing in Facebook? These are all sort of images of Facebook, right? Where's China? Because China censors the Facebook, right? And so it's controlled by a single authority. And now add voice or facial recognition software, and now we see the persecution of the church, because as you walk into a room like this and maybe you're talking at church, there's a camera, or one of them around as you walk in and you associate with one another, and there goes your social credit score down, and so all of a sudden that you cannot travel on an aircraft or something like that because you're having ideas that are not appropriate. Couple other things. The idea of hypertext comes back even in the 1940s. The human mind operates by association of thoughts and according with some intricate web of trails. Hypertext is you bounce around, right? And we know what hypertext is. This is thought of back in 1945, before you can actually do the technology, but now you do. And notice, I'm sorry, I'm talking too fast. Notice how different it is as you go bouncing from verse to verse, rather than follow Paul's argument in Galatians or in Romans, okay? Brief history of the internet, or of how the Internet of Things come. It is somewhat recent. It's in some of our lifetimes, many dramatic changes in our lifetimes. The internet is born in 1974. In 1995, I remember this, because that's when the internet becomes commercial. Before that point, it was governmental and academic. And 1995, you can actually make a living off it. It dramatically transforms that medium. The smartphone, invented 2007. Now we're close to 50 billion connections. We understand that that's going to shape different things. Some of it, commerce, we all know the little symbols that are there because we live in that. But also a difference between a hierarchical way and a networked type of thinking. Okay? So we understand how those specific technologies are and how those changed it and how it changes us reading the Bible and disseminating the faith. We're moving towards a transhumanist experience and a singularity. And I went back and looked at McLuhan from 1964. And what does McLuhan say? Having extended or translated our central nervous system into the electromagnetic technology, it is but a further stage to transfer our consciousness to the computer as well. Might not our current translation of our entire lives into the spiritual form of information seem to make of the entire globe and the entire family, human family, a single consciousness? Sounds like Peter Thiel, right? Or Elon Musk in some ways, or Mark Zuckerberg. But this is before it's even possible, but what you're thinking of it, so the digital age is over, it's actually about 70 years old. And we're in the middle of that transition. So let's go from 1450 to 70 years after 1450. 1450, let's say, is the invention of Gutenberg's press. That gives us 1520, right? If I'm doing my math correctly, which is right when the Reformation is, okay? We're in the midst of this. And so we can see that transhumanist future. We know how the phone is. We know that if you've got your Fitbit, right, and next your insurance company is going to send you a text and saying you don't have your 10,000 steps in, and so you're not as healthy as you need to be. And thus, if you start going down to 9,000, we're going to increase your insurance rates. Then you get the enhancement of the human, and then the actually fully singular of uploading in that transatlantic consciousness. Now let's go back to what we are. Premise, our digital age is analogous to the print revolution. We're living in the middle of that same kind of transition. It was enormously transformative for Protestantism. What is the impact on print technology on Christianity? It made it biblical. It reverted back to the biblical text. What is the digital revolution going to do with us? Couple things. This is Postman again. All tech change is a trade-off. It's not evenly distributed. The medium is the message. Technological change is not additive, it's ecological. We can't go back to a non-digital, something we're not wired. First thing I did when I was planning to come here is, how's the internet at the hotel? It was decent, okay. Media becomes mythic, it becomes part of the natural order. So we'll go back and say Christianity and the Bible in a digital age, strategies for the future. We've looked at the alphabet and the technology of writing. We looked at the technology of printing, right? Written word to the spoken word, Socrates' warning, technology of printing, Victor Hugo's warning about print and books in stone, or the visual world, the digital, that technology of the network. This is my church last Sunday. How does it shape differently of the visual? I'm glad it's above, but if you're in the balcony, you couldn't see the cross, right? And you want to think about what is being shown, right? And especially when he shows a video. It's like you're watching video. And one sort of piece again from McLuhan. When the technology of a time is powerfully thrusting in one direction, wisdom may well call for a countervailing thrust. So now it's time to open, right? How does a religion, our faith, depending upon a written word, transition to the digital age? And how should we shape our message for this future?